I'd like to call this meeting to order. Welcome to meeting number 89 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Science and Research. Before I begin, I'd like to ask all the members and other in-person participants to consult the cards on the tables for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. This is very important to protect the hearing of our interpreters. We are only to use the black approved earpiece. And keep your earpiece away from the microphones at all times. If you're not using it, please rest it on the stickers placed on the table. Thank you very much for your cooperation. The meeting is taking place in a hybrid format, and we have several witnesses and members of the committee online. So for those participating virtually, I'd like to outline a few routine rules to follow. You may speak in the official language of your choice. Interpretation services are available for this meeting. You have the choice at the bottom of your screen, either floor, English, or French. If interpretation is lost, please inform me immediately, and we will ensure interpretation is properly restored before resuming the proceedings. Before speaking, please wait until I recognize you by name. If you are on the video conference, please click on the microphone icon to unmute yourself. When you are not speaking, your mic should be on mute. For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, please use the raise hand function. The clerk and I will manage the speaking order as best we can, and we appreciate your understanding in this regard. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. Pursuant to Standing Order 1083I and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, January 31st, 2023, the committee resumes its study of science and research in Canada's Arctic in relation to climate change. It's now my pleasure to welcome, as an individual, Dr. Kirk Anderson, Professor of UArctic Chair for School Effectiveness, Memorial University of Newfoundland, and the University of the Arctic by video conference. Dr. Bing Chen, UArctic Chair, Professor and Associate Dean, Memorial University of Newfoundland by video conference, and Dr. Isla Myers-Smith, Professor, University of British Columbia by video conference. We also, by video conference, have from University de Quebec à Rimouski, Joël Bette, Professor, Canada Research Chair in Northern Biodiversity. We will give you up to 5 minutes for opening remarks, after which we will proceed with rounds of questions. Dr. Anderson and Dr. Chen, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, so you can divide the time however you like between you.
Do you want us to start now,
Yes,
Madam Chair?
please. Yes, please.
Okay. Being on promise, 2 minutes. Okay, thank you for your efforts as you lead our government in acting on this existential issue. I'm Kirk Anderson. I was a teacher and a principal for nearly 20 years. 8 of this was in northern coastal Labrador. I'm a former Dean of Education and a past president of the Canadian Deans Association in Canada. I'm currently a professor at Memorial University and University Arctic Chair for School Effectiveness. As Dean, I led the development of a $5 million Science, Technology, Engineering, Mathematics STEM grant, where we targeted development of to enhance field-based skills for teachers, and also piloted a STEM Bachelor of Education focused on elementary teachers. I also led the development and implementation of a community-based teacher education process called the Inuit Focus PED, the IBET. This was a partnership with the government of Nunavut and us, and we worked diligently there to indigenize our approach to teaching, and it also included a Nuktitut language for the teacher candidates. Based on that success, I worked to develop and conclude the first contract with the Nunavut Arctic College, where we collaborated to develop to promote and serve the Nunavut Teacher Education Program. This was part of our university's long-term agreement to work with the Nunavut Arctic College and its goal to become an Arctic university. My key research areas are Indigenous schools, teacher development in the North, and school leadership. A key aspect of all my work is to empower people and communities, particularly in the North, the Indigenous context, by reshaping educational research and teaching. Our schools are amongst the best in the world. We're particularly good at student achievements and asserting social justice, dealing with different socioeconomic status. Related to this, while faculty of education are strong, we do develop good teachers. We are not so well connected with other academic interests or STEM-focused researchers. In this response to this, many of my actions are, as an educational administrator and researcher, are to build indigenous partnerships and reach out to other fields to make teacher development more interdisciplinary and find ways to connect their research efforts, particularly with the STEM areas. For example, my action plan as University Arctic Chair is to create a truly community-based teacher education model for northern schools, as well as create a northern and indigenous doctoral group focused on education reflective of interdisciplinary fields while engaging communities. We must collaborate with the northern communities and other fields in order to empower them to control their destiny. Thank you.
So that's it for both of you then?
No, Dr.
No.
Chin.
Oh,
Thank you, Kirk. Thank you, dear Madam Chair and the honorable committee members. Hello from the Arctic. So first, I want to express my huge gratitude to all of you for taking on this very important subject. I also want to apologize for not being there in person due to my travel to Bordeaux, Norway. Here I'm attending the Congress of the University of the Arctic, given my duties as the Academic Advisory Board member and also a U-Arctic Research Chair. My name is Bing Chen. I'm a professor, U-Arctic Chair, and Associate Dean of Faculty of Engineering and Applied Science at Memorial University. I also served as a founding director of the Northern Region Persistent Organic Pollution Laboratory, or NRPOP in short. It's the first of kind in the country and dedicated to oil spills and environmental pollution in coal regions and oceans. I'm also the founding director of People Network, a pan-Canadian and global network on persistent, emerging, and organic pollution in the environments. As a world-leading consortium, we have over 300 professional members, including more than 200 researchers from over 40 research institutions and 50 partners from government, industry, communities, including indigenous groups in Canada and worldwide. I'm an elective fellow of the Canadian Academy of Engineering and also the incoming president of the Canadian Society for Civil Engineering. My research targets two major environmental challenges, and they are intertwined. The first one is about persistent and emerging contaminants, such as petroleum hydrocarbons, flame retardants, microplastics, and the pharmaceutical and personal care products, etc. That are toxic, carcinogenic, and bioaccumulative, and persistent in the environment, especially in the cold region, like Arctic. Importantly, most of them are not regulated. And the other major challenge is climate change, which it seems everyone knows, but what most people don't know is that climate change makes pollution problems much more challenging. In the Canadian Arctic, we are facing increasing risk of oil spills and emerging pollution due to shrinking ice coverage and growing human activities under climate change. They are threatening our Arctic environments and the residents, especially including indigenous communities. There are pressing needs for better knowledge, technology, policy to support sustainable development. Frankly, we are walking on thin ice. So this is why I thank you very much for looking into this subject. Thank you, Madam Chair.
so we'll now turn to Dr. Isla Meyer-Smith for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you to the chair and to the members for the opportunity to speak about my research in the Canadian Arctic on climate change impacts. I'm a Canada Excellence Research Chair in Global Change Ecology of Northern Ecosystems at the University of British Columbia, and I've been working in the Arctic for 2 decades. Today, I'd like to share some reflections on how Arctic research is changing and needs to shift in future as the inclusivity of research changes and climate change impacts accelerate. I want to start by talking about how the North is experiencing accelerating change, and what would have previously been considered extremes are now becoming the new normal. So for example, last summer in 2023, in the Western Arctic, we experienced a heat wave in July. The temperatures are around 5 degrees warmer than the historic maximum temperatures on Qeqertark Herschel Island on the Yukon Arctic coast where I work. After this heat wave, we observed widespread permafrost disturbance, including the formation of 750 landslides, influencing about 1% of this island in just 1 year. This island has some of the most ice-rich permafrost in the Canadian Arctic and around the circumpolar Arctic, and it's always experienced permafrost disturbances and coastal erosion, but the rates and magnitudes of thaw are accelerating dramatically. This past summer was also dominated by forest fires, leading to the evacuation of communities within the Northwest Territories, and our research program was threatened with being shut down due to forest fires and the evacuations happening to the south of us. For my research program, permafrost thaw, flooding, and forest fires are making it increasingly difficult to study the impacts of climate change. I collaborate with Inuvialuit and First Nations communities, government agencies, and different academic researchers to understand how vegetation change is influencing the Arctic, including increases in plants, more shrubs, earlier growing seasons, and how all of that is influencing the habitats for wildlife and the livelihoods for people. One example of this collaboration is the Porcupine Caribou Knowledge Hub, funded by Canada's Strategic Science Fund through a network now called Braiding Knowledges Canada. There are 5 challenges that I would like to raise today. The first is the importance of including Inuvialuit, Inuit, and First Nations in research collaborations. To understand climate change impacts, research is required across different scales, from place-based research that informs local management and adaptation through to Arctic, circumarctic research that informs Earth system models. And as the funding models shift, we need to consider all the different types of research and the different types of collaborations required for that next phase of Arctic research, following Indigenous and global research priorities. Secondly, I want to talk about the increased costs of Arctic research and the importance of logistical support. My research program depends on the logistical support through programs like the Polar Continental Shelf Program and the NSERC Northern Research Supplement, and the logistical support provided by research stations and institutes. As we enhance our collaborations with Indigenous partners, our research and logistical costs increase, and thus additional funding is required. And a lot of these programs aren't providing adequate funding to cover those logistical costs right now. I also want to talk about the broad sharing of research findings while incorporating factors such as Indigenous data sovereignty. As we form a better understanding of climate change impacts around the Arctic, a challenge for researchers is to get that information back to the people who need that information to make decisions. And often our research funding doesn't cover that full cycle of costs, from the co-production of the research questions through to the communication of those findings to broad audiences and the archiving of data. And that funding model needs to change. I also want to touch on building research capacity within the Arctic and bringing people together. New tools such as drones are reshaping how we conduct Arctic research and monitoring. Indigenous Guardian programs and different research teams are using the same tools. And by bringing researchers together, we can increase capacity within the North. An example of this is the Yukon Drone Workshop that we held in the second week of May of this year, bringing First Nations, government agencies, and academic researchers together to share expertise. And the final point I want to make is about the influence of geopolitical events on increased international collaboration. So collaborative research within the Russian Arctic has stopped, and international research teams are pivoting their research programs often towards the Canadian Arctic. New funding opportunities, such as Canada joining the EU Horizon program and the Nordforce program, will facilitate even more Arctic research within Canada. But this increased research activity is putting more pressure on Indigenous communities. Many of these Indigenous communities have capacity issues to engage with this increased research pressure. So future funding programs should particularly consider how to alleviate the impacts on Indigenous communities of the required increased research within the Canadian Arctic. Thank you very much.
So much. Really appreciate that, Dr. Myers-Smith. Under the wire. We'll now turn to Dr. Joel Betty, Professor Research Chair in Northern Biodiversity. For 5 minutes, please.
Merci, Madame la
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. Thank you for your interest in the impact of climate change and the impact. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to exchange with you. I am a biologist and teacher at the Université du Québec in Rimouski. I've been doing research in this area for the past 30 years. I co-chair activities and I work in the various research institutions in the North, and these are multidisciplinary and multi-university initiatives. We've seen that biodiversity is a major threat in the Arctic, worsened by many others. This biodiversity has economic significant impact. Biodiversity contributes to food sovereignty in the communities of the North. Arctic biodiversity is also important for the rest of the world. The Canadian Arctic is connected to the rest of the planet because there are millions of animals that complete their cycle of life in the Arctic. Some of these species generate economic benefits estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars annually in southern Canada. And some populations can also cause crop damage and substantial financial losses for North American farmers. There's also, for example, the spread of avian flu. In this context, Arctic biodiversity research is generating knowledge in Canada and for other countries in the world. However, we need data from standardized long-term observations of Arctic biodiversity to detect changes and identify their cause, understand and predict the response of ecosystems to warming, propose adaptation strategies, and identify new opportunities. Long-term observations in the Arctic help differentiate normal variability inherent in natural systems from abnormal changes caused by global warming. Right now, there's limited long-term monitoring of wildlife biodiversity at the ecosystem level. Most research funding programs support short-term projects focused on novelty, which limits the ability to set up and maintain long-term monitoring programs. There are excellent federal programs to fund Arctic research in the North. For example, the Arctic Research Supplements, Polar Continental Shelf Program, and so on. Unfortunately, the funds do not keep pace with rapidly rising research and cannot cover the cost of the project. Furthermore, research infrastructures now limit the capacity to meet the needs expressed by the northern communities. The increase in construction costs have led to some difficulties with infrastructure projects. It is also difficult for universities researchers to find the funds necessary to maintain the research infrastructures in the North. So programs should support current infrastructure and come up with agreements to enable joint management of infrastructure by various stakeholders in the Arctic. Research collaboration between academia and northern communities requires specific knowledge and soft skills, but for many researchers in the academic environment, they need qualified assistance to co-produce and co-manage research with communities of the North. It would be beneficial to come up with a national support program that will facilitate collaboration between researchers, experts, and northern communities. Lastly, new funding programs should offer more time for preparation of requests to promote co-design of projects and collaboration between university researchers and the northern communities. Of course, all of academia must intensify its effort in the North to increase research participation and research autonomy. I look forward to answering your questions to the best of my knowledge, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much to all of our witnesses this morning, all of whom were very, very respectful of our time commitment, so I appreciate that. We're now going to open the floor to questions, and please be sure to indicate to whom your questions are directed, and we'll kick that off with MP Toker for 6 minutes.
Thank you so much, and thank you for our witnesses for your testimony today. Professor Betty, very impressive 30-year history of researching the North, and especially on the animal reproduction side of things. We do know the importance of the seal hunt to the indigenous population. Can you explain a little bit of some of your research on seals and the seal hunt that has impacted the North?
Thank you for your question. Unfortunately, I am a specialist on animals on land. I work mostly on tundra and birds on land, so I'm not a specialist on species that live in marine areas.
Part of the testimony, are any of the witnesses have done any work on the seal hunt in the Arctic? All right, and I understand this is all this research is in the Arctic, but you're all located in the South. Of the ones, I guess, to the professor from Newfoundland. Where's my question here? So, actually, Professor Myers-Smith, you talked a little bit about adaptation, and we've had other witnesses talk about adaptation versus mitigation. In the North, you studied adaptation. Have you done any work on the mitigation of the effects of climate change in the North?
So when we think about climate change in the North, the adaptation issues are local and the mitigation issues are global, so beyond the scope of Canada. So the mitigation has to happen at an international scale and at a Canadian scale, but it's less relevant for mitigation to happen within the North because the populations are so much smaller. But the adaptation issues are very much directed to these northern communities. And so yes, a lot of the research does focus on adaptation that I do, that my colleagues do, but we're thinking about it from my perspective as a terrestrial ecologist studying plants, often about food systems, livelihoods in the north, and the hunting of key wildlife species and the habitat of those species. So how will climate change influence vegetation, and how will that influence wildlife and therefore people?
On that research, what would have been a success story? What have you researched that is actually impacting lives in the North through adaptation?
So I work in the Western Canadian Arctic, and there's a caribou herd called the Porcupine Caribou Herd, and I mentioned in my testimony the knowledge hub of the Porcupine Caribou Herd, and so this effort, which is beyond just my own research program, brings all the people together who have an interest in that caribou herd, and each year we meet and we discuss how climate change is playing out and influencing the herd, how vegetation is changing, but also how people are harvesting the herd and what the population levels are. And one of the really good news stories in the Western Arctic is that herd, the population levels are healthy at the moment, but surrounding that herd are other populations of caribou that are not doing as well. And so trying to understand why some caribou herds do well and others don't, and really thinking forward to the future and whether the porcupine caribou herd will start to decline in future. All of that research is coming together to help inform local communities on how to manage that herd.
Thank you. And then switching to Professor Chen, understanding that you're from Newfoundland, and one of the mitigation strategies is utilization of heat pumps. And I was wondering if you had any personal experience in your house having a heat pump.
Thank you. I think that's an interesting question. I don't have the heat pumps, but I know that because also our university will offer some renewable energy education programs, and there's some teaching materials, and also we are attracting students globally. I think doing more renewable energy. That heat pump is one of the technologies has been spreading. Yeah, and by the way, regarding your adaptation, could you allow me to give you some examples I have been doing for adaptation for the northern, especially residents in distant communities? Yeah, I think what we are doing, because by training I'm an engineer, so I did indeed look at the solutions, how to provide a better technology. One thing I think is talking about the emerging contaminants. There's two ways. One is online, one is on shipping. I think we all know because of ice cap is shrinking, we have open water channel, and we have more shipping activities in the north. I think in Canadian Arctic is almost 3 times in the past 3 decades. And but on the other hand, we are also looking at the polar code of MORPA and also our regulation regarding how to regulate the ships, and they're producing wastewater discharge to the ocean. And but
just on that, I'm limited to time here. I'm sorry to interrupt, but is the government doing enough to support shipping in the north right now as sea lanes are opening up that we could utilize for shipments?
I think what we are. The reality is, because of the open ice, we have more activities from the polar cold areas to our Canadian Arctic. I don't know what's the detailed regulation, but the observation is we have growing ship and also whalage in the north. And so this is why I think globally we are looking into the new contaminants, and because all our regulations targeting the traditional pollution, like our grey water, especially now, look at the data, we have more cruise ship, I think 3 times, and oil tankers, and 2 times to 3 times increase. And think about the cruise ship, we have several thousand people on board, and basically a small city.
That's our time. Dr. Chen?
Sorry.
I'm sorry, it's fascinating. Maybe one of the other members of the committee will pursue that. So now we're going to turn to MP Chen for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you very much to the witnesses before our committee today. Going back to Professor Chen, I'm noting here that you are a professor in environmental engineering and a recognized leader in research and applications, particularly with respect to mitigating the effects of climate change, as well as responses to emergencies such as oil spills and other disasters. You have some experience, I understand, in looking at AI-aided decision-making. So I'm curious on this issue if you could share a bit more about how AI and other technologies can help in tackling climate change.
Thank you very much. That's really an interesting question. So I think now we are embracing the new technologies. AI is part of that. I think there's several things what we have been doing. One is look at the historic data, because we have spent a lot of investment on data collection in the past decades, and how to use the existing data and how to wisely use them and develop, the new methods to find out something we didn't know. And that's very interesting. And for example, what we are doing, like oil spill related, we look at human factors. From the top layers, from the decision makers, policy making, to the bottom, the operators, the crews. So what kind of human mistakes or even incomplete training, incomplete knowledge, the lack of experience, those kind of errors, the mistakes made, leading to a disaster, leading to a emergency response, and during the response, how people react, and their human factors contributing to the consequences. I think we collected several hundred cases and look at the human factors, and the interesting finding is human factors contribute 70 to 80% of all those man-made disasters, especially ship-related, oil spill-related. So that's one thing we are doing that. On the other hand, we're also using the growing data we collected from the air to the sea, and we try to predict what's going to happen. And if it happened, what we should do under an emergency if that's a oil spill incident happened. Considering like a BP oil spill in Gulf of Mexico, if a similar magnitude oil spill happened, unfortunately, in Arctic, there will be huge disaster, but how we can react, how could we be prepared for that? And I think from the professional responders, that's what we have been training, what we have been supporting, and also to the communities, how they could be prepared, and they gain some basic knowledge to understand what is a spill and how I can report, how I can protect myself, etc. So all those things collectively together, you're talking about a huge amount of data and also very diverse of data. And even the format, I think that's one of the key challenges is we have a lot of data, different agencies, different organizations, but they have probably in different format, different deposits, right? How to consolidate data together and how to more efficiently, timely use data to support the decision making, the responders, to save the time, save the life, save the cost. So that's what we have been doing. I'm developing some tools for that.
Thank you very much. Turning over to Professor Myers-Smith, you also spoke about data and the importance of sharing broad research findings in respecting Indigenous sovereignty. And of course, we've just heard from Professor Chen about how data over time can be collected and used to fuel solutions. Professor Myers-Smith, you also have talked a lot about the different challenges of increased cost of Arctic research and the need to build research capacity in the north. I want to ask you about the development of an Arctic science strategy. Canada is an Arctic nation. The work that you folks are doing is incredibly important. Do you think Canada should have such a strategy?
I definitely think Canada should have. I think Canada does have, through different agencies, an Arctic strategy in place. But maybe we need to be thinking about updating that strategy, thinking forward to the future of the Arctic, which could be quite different from the Arctic that we have experienced in the past, and particularly within a research context. I've listened back to previous meetings of this committee, and also I want to echo Joëlle Betty's comments. I think there's two things that have come out. One is this idea of a distributed hub for research logistics, a hub and spoke model. And then the other thing is having sort of distributed centers that link researchers and Indigenous communities. And one way you could phrase that is as knowledge hubs across the Canadian Arctic, because there's limitations on the community side and there's limitations on the research side. And so something in the middle that can bring the research together and help with that communication of research back to the people who are making policy decisions, but also potentially the hosting of research within the Canadian North.
Logistics, and that's come across in a number of.
You're really out of time. Sorry.
Okay, just very quickly then, do you find it challenging? You mentioned the use of drones, but we're talking also about logistics for researchers. So do you find that there's more capacity that can be built in terms of adopting technologies to support your research in the Arctic?
Short answer, yes, and the technology will continue to shift, and so we need to be able to adapt to that changing technology and keep going out into the Arctic to use that technology to its maximum.
Thank you. So now we'll turn to MP Blanchette-Jocat for 6 minutes.
Merci, Madame la Présidente. Je salue les témoins qui sont avec nous aujourd'hui.
Thank you, Chair. Greetings to the witnesses. My first question goes to Mr. Beatty. We are delighted to have you here. First of all, congratulations on your many years of commitment in this domain. You've received lots of awards and distinctions, and it's an honor and a pleasure to have you today. Mr. Beatty, my first questions for you. As a teacher and Canada Research Chair on Arctic biodiversity, could you give us examples of initiatives for research abroad that Canada can learn from? Answer, yes. Thank you for your question. Yes, indeed. I think we have very good examples elsewhere in the world when it comes to long-term monitoring. Some countries like Denmark, Norway have introduced ecosystemic long-term programs, and these involve environmentalists and researchers. For example, there's a long-term program on ecosystems and climate change in the Arctic, and for many years now, this program promotes an integrated follow-up for land ecosystems. It's based on interdisciplinary data collection, and every year, they send about 75 scientists on the field to collect standardized data with the same types of samples. And these things are measured and made available free of charge. The data are used by scientists, the public, external partners, and so on. So from that data, we could produce consultative reports, scientific reports, and so on. In Norway, there's another similar system. So these long-term monitoring programs that are interdisciplinary are very good and help understand the indirect effects of climate warming or change in the Arctic. And these are the kind of examples we should learn here in Canada. Thank you, Mr. Beatty. From my opinion, and relying on the witnesses that came here to talk about competition between the northern countries and comparing it to other programs you've mentioned, I'm also relying on the report from the chief scientist, Ms. Nemer, her report on the Polar Continental Program. In her report about the program, she says that Canada should try to be a global leader in northern research because of its control over the territory. Mr. Boudreau, who was the first chair of Savoir Polaire Canada, told us that Canada lacks researchers and lacks funding as well. So I would like to hear what you have to say about that. Yes, indeed. You mentioned a very important program, the Polar Continental Program, and we were extremely surprised to learn that most of their budget was not safe. And this has created a lot of anguish amongst university researchers in Canada. So this budget do not keep pace with the rising cost of research in the Arctic. So this is a major problem. I think we have great research capacity here in Canada. I think the situation is weak considering that some programs do not receive the funding they need to keep pace with research costs. We have lots of global leaders in Arctic research here. And we also have programs like the Northern Supplement Program. I'm part of the selection team. There are lots of things we cannot support because we don't have funding, particularly programs that respond to the needs of the communities. We can't support them. The money we receive is similar to what we received 20 years ago. So it is inconceivable considering the significant increase in the cost of research in the Arctic. So I think that Canada, of course, is part of the global leaders, but this situation is not tenable. Some programs deserve more attention, and we do have global leaders in Canada. We need to remind ourselves of that. Question: we don't do Arctic research without money. I would like to hear you talk about what we hear. The first president of Savoir-Polaire Canada tells us that countries like Iceland had a lot more researchers, 13 times more researchers per square meter compared to Canada. You see other countries that have intensive research activity because of the support they receive from the governments, like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and so on. So what do you think about that, considering your expertise in the domain? I do not have any figures considering the number of researchers elsewhere, but what I can tell you is that when there's funding to support research, researchers will follow. So if we invest more in Nordic research and Arctic research, the number of researchers working there will increase. So there are many universities that produce highly qualified staff. They are ready to invest in northern research, but of course it takes funding to be able to support these projects in the north. Mr. Beatty, concretely, what are the consequences of underfunding or rather the funding that is not sustained over the long term? What is its impact in northern research in particular? Answer: when it comes to the impact, one of the significant impacts is that sometimes we end things we've started. For example, if we want to understand the changes, the causes, we need long-term temporal changes. But because of lack of funding, sometimes we have to stop some of this monitoring and this temporal series research. So lack of funding sometimes limits our impact.
Time. Okay, so now we will turn to MP Cannings for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you, and thank you all for being here today. I'm going to start with Dr. Myers-Smith. And on a personal note, I just want to say we had Dave Hick here on Tuesday before the committee, so it's wonderful to have another alumna of the Kluane Arctic Institute research station before us that has gone on to do important work in the Arctic. And, you know, we were talking just earlier about mitigation versus adaptation. Just wondering if you could comment on the need for simply work that monitors the effects that climate change is having on the Arctic. It's being impacted several times more than we are down here. You talked about permafrost changes, and Herschel Island is the poster child there. Those permafrost melting incidents release methane into the atmosphere, which causes a vicious circle of climate impacts. We have melting sea ice, which does the same there, where you have loss of albedo on the ocean, which warms the Earth faster. How important is it for Canada to be leading the world in monitoring climate impacts in the Arctic?
It's So I think it's vital that internationally we monitor what's going on in the Arctic, and that Canada is perhaps the premier hub of leading that international effort. And we do need a component of monitoring, because some of the changes that are going on in the Arctic we cannot predict in advance, and we need continuous and consistent methods collecting data to understand the change that's playing out. And why we need to understand that change is because those feedbacks that can happen within the Arctic, changes to the ecosystems, changes to the permafrost, changes to sea ice have global implications. So we see 4 times the rate of warming in the Arctic relative to the rest of the planet, and the impacts of that warming in the Arctic is influencing the climate for the rest of the planet. So what we do now in terms of releasing greenhouse gases is influencing the Arctic now. Those changes are playing out in a way that we can't fully mitigate at this point. And the impacts of those changes that will play out over the coming decades are going to influence that global climate and the rate of warming for the entire planet. So what happens in the Arctic will not stay within the Arctic. It's going to influence all of us, and we have to monitor those changes, and we have to have integrated research programs with all players involved to really document the impacts of climate change.
Well, thanks. And you also mentioned logistic support. We know that the Arctic is a big place. It's very difficult and expensive to travel around. You mentioned the Polar Shelf Project, which has been kind of the heart of logistics for Arctic research for many years. I remember hearing in 2018, I think, that Polar Shelf hadn't received an increase in its budget for 20 years. And I think there was an adjustment then, but I'm just wondering if you could comment on that logistic support, using Polar Shelf as an example, perhaps, in terms of how much funding it receives and how it should be designed. You talked briefly about the hub and spoke model, and perhaps just give us an idea of what you think would work best to support Canadian research in the Arctic.
Well, I think a really important point to maybe start out with the Polar Continental Shelf funding is it does support research within the Canadian Arctic, across the Canadian Arctic. So I'm working in the far west of the Canadian Arctic, right along the Alaska border, and Polar Continental Shelf does support my research. However, the hub for Polar Continental Shelf is based in the Eastern Arctic. So I'm very far from the logistics people, but the funding, and they're still helping me out, even though I'm thousands of kilometers away in the west with my research team. And just to put some numbers on it, so to get to my research site, Qikiqtarjuq, Herschel Island, you take a charter airplane flight from Inuvik, and you need to get to Inuvik first, and then that charter airplane flight, it's about 1 hour. It a few years ago cost $7,000 one way, then it was $8,000 one way. This summer it will be $9,000, $10,000 one way for one trip for a few members of my research team. So we have to take multiple of those trips per summer. The costs are accelerating at an enormous pace because of the cost of fuel, because of other logistical constraints. And so Polar Continental Shelf comes in and supports those costs to allow us to use our research funds for the actual research. Without that logistical support, we could not go to these sites, and these sites are where climate change impacts are playing out. We need to be there on the ground.
Well, thank you. And I'd like to turn to Dr. Betty and ask more or less similar questions. I know, Dr. Betty, you've studied snow geese, and you mentioned about the impacts. Again, what happens in the Arctic affects us further south. Perhaps you could talk about what the populations of snow geese have been doing in response to climate change and other things, and how complex that is, but how it affects us in the temperate parts of North America.
Oui, merci pour votre question.
Thank you for your question. I would like to say that migratory species are influenced by factors that are happening everywhere in the whole world. For example, like for the snow geese, the birds are affected not only by what is happening in the Arctic, but because of the farming strategies in the south. What we've seen internationally is an increase in various populations of white geese, ducks, and others caused by farming practices that have increased the density of these populations in the Arctic. These increases of the white geese has an impact in the Arctic. They could have a negative impact on vegetation and transform the vegetation and have negative impacts on other species that are declining.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to MP Lobb for 5 minutes.
Thanks very much. My first question is for Ms. Myers-Smith. And the question is, in some of your research, you've done work on the tree line. And I just wondered if you could expand a little bit more on that work and what is shown you. Thank you.
Yes, I've done a little bit of work on the tree line. A lot of my research focuses on the shrub line, which is the next line up as you move across the Arctic. So you have, as you move northwards and also as you move up slopes in mountain ranges, you hit an elevational edge, which is where trees stop growing. And then beyond that, large woody shrubs stop growing, and then you end up with shorter plants, and then eventually plants stop growing altogether. And one of the impacts of climate change is that those edges can be moving either northwards or upslope. So you get taller vegetation, more woody vegetation, more carbon in that vegetation, but changes to the below ground environment as well that can influence things like permafrost thaw and create some of those climate feedbacks. And that changes the habitat for wildlife as well.
The historical shrub line and tree line, what does it tell us? Is there the ability, have you had the ability to do the research on the historical moves up and down?
Yeah, so if you think about history, we could go back to the last ice age, and when we're doing that kind of work, we're working with pollen, and so you have a much more coarse understanding of where the tree line and the shrub line were. But in the past, the Arctic has been a pretty shrubby place, and tree lines have been further north when the climate was warmer. And so, and then the climate got cooler, those lines receded. What we're actually seeing to a certain extent is the movement of tree and shrub lines northwards still as a response to the last ice age. But now on top of that, we have anthropogenic warming. So that movement of tree lines and shrub lines. The shrub line also moves a lot faster than the tree line. So that vegetation change is happening faster now because of anthropogenic warming on top of that response to the last ice age.
So then in your 20 years, if I missed it, I apologize, you would have seen a noticeable difference in the move northwards then?
So what we particularly pick up at the sites that I work at is an increase in the shrubs that were already in those ecosystems becoming much more dominant. And I have a series of photos, I'd be happy to share them with the committee afterwards, where you can see the vegetation change. It's dramatic from the 1980s to now at some of the sites where I work. There were hardly any shrubs, and now those landscapes are dominated by sort of thigh-high woody shrubs, really changing the habitats for wildlife and the carbon cycling in these systems.
Okay, so in this current period of history, it's dramatic, but maybe over decades or centuries, not as dramatic, or is this unprecedented right now, you think?
I would say that the rate of change is unprecedented. It's hard to get that picture going really far back because it becomes more coarse, but the rates of change in the last 3 decades are much more dramatic than earlier within the last century, and our projections are that rate of change is going to increase in future for many parameters within the Arctic.
Question before my time runs out is coordination, and I think with your experience you might have some important comments for the committee on how well research is coordinated right now across the entire Arctic, how you're able to do your research and contribute and coordinate with other areas, and how does that work? How does it need improvement, and what's your overall thoughts?
I've devoted a lot of my career to trying to bring researchers together to do what we would call synthesis. So we're all working at different sites around the Arctic. We work together to pool our data sets, to ask questions with that full circum-Arctic data set. Currently, a lot of that synthesis requires on individuals putting their own energy and their own research funds to making those kind of that research come together. There are programs in other countries that focus on funding synthesis alone, and I've benefited from those programs in Germany and in the US. And I think it could be really exciting if Canada had that same kind of funding just for the synthesis, for bringing data together, for bringing people together, for bringing researchers together with northern communities to look at these questions. And I think that's an area where the Canadian government doesn't currently provide very much funding at all.
I think that's a key point. It sounds like internationally there are a few avenues to coordinate the international efforts. but maybe you're correct in your assessment that there's maybe more the federal government could do to take a Canadian coordinated leadership role, perhaps.
Yeah.
How much time left?
12 seconds.
Okay, I'll tack it on to the next meeting. How's that?
Okay. So now we're going to turn to MP Kellaway for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and it's great to be here in person on this committee. Some great testimony. I have 3 questions, one for Dr. Anderson, one for Dr. Chen, and one for Professor Myers-Smith. For many years, I worked at Cape Breton University and the Nova Scotia Community College. While I was at Cape Breton University, I had the privilege of spending some time in the Unama'ki College, where the focus was on, the research side was focused on Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and Western science. And so my question for Dr. Anderson, I'm wondering if you can unpack just briefly, I know, the importance of Indigenous knowledge and observations when it comes to climate change in the Arctic. And do you think the Indigenous knowledge side is being adequately represented in current studies of climate change in the Arctic?
Thank you. I think we're trying. I certainly is getting a lot of talk and airplay. An example of one of the things we deal with in respect to Indigenous knowledge or Northern engagement, in my view, education, the discussion on access to the North by shipping. There was no mention of the fact that as shipping advances north, it disrupts Indigenous travel routes. You know, so the question for me is, how do we defend Indigenous travel routes, not how do we more successfully have ships from the south go north? So that's an Indigenous perspective. That's a local's perspective. So I think we're doing better at it, and I would argue again that we have villages and hamlets all across the north where we have people who live there who are quite skilled, and we should be leaving something to the benefit of those communities that stays with them when our researchers leave. Now, we're doing better at that, but a more formal arrangement where we're including Indigenous peoples and people who are educated will benefit us from the Indigenous perspectives. And kudos to Cape Breton University for the great work they're doing as well.
Thank you, Doctor. I want to go to Dr. Chen. Your testimony and some of the answers to your questions really got me thinking about the contaminants in the North and climate change and the climate crisis. As Parliamentary Secretary for Fisheries, Oceans and the Coast Guard, it's of particular interest to me where I live on the East Coast of what's happening with respect to environmental change. So when you talked about the 2 issues, contaminants and climate change, and then you talked about prognostication, and I wonder if you could just take just a little bit of time just to unpack some items that may keep you up at night in terms of where we're going. You did highlight it in terms of the impact to the environment, but I'm wondering if you could take one specific example, maybe 50 seconds or so, and then I'll move on to Professor Myers-Smith.
Oh, yes, that's a really good question. I think one example I can tell you, like the project I just did last year, we collect water and soil samples from Yellowknife around the Great Slave Lakes, and that's really community-based. We have community members on the team. So, and we try to identify the PBDE. That's a very typical flame retardant. That's claimed as an emerging contaminant. That's toxic, carcinogenic, and everywhere from our, sheets, car, and appliances, everywhere. So we surprisingly found we collect more than 150 samples of soil and water, and almost 100% detection of the PBD. And they not only on the surface, it's deep, also even in the permafrost. So those contaminants now is area, even the microplastic. Meanwhile, we also detect microplastics in very deep, 1.5 meters deep. And you drill the permafrost like concrete. So those things already there. And how to protect our community, especially that through the river, lakes to their food web,
right.
The food and the water, drinking water. So that's
Thank you, Professor. I have to stop you there because I have about 30 seconds left, or maybe a little bit less, but I wanted to get to Professor Myers-Smith. You talked about the hub and spoke example, and I'm a big proponent of that. We talked about building capacity in Indigenous communities. I'm wondering if there's one or two things you could give us advice on to work on that. Obviously money, but is there something else that we need to be doing that we're not doing now? And I'll yield the floor after your answer. Thank you.
Very good. So I think a very quick response to this is that it's people capacity that's a limitation as well. So we need the money, but we need the people, and we need people who have the training to bring together academic research, government research, and the work that Indigenous communities are doing on monitoring ecosystems. And we need that to happen in a distributed fashion across the Canadian Arctic. So covering areas close to communities, but also areas further away from communities.
Thank you very much. We'll now turn to MP Blanchette-Jonca for 2.5 minutes.
Madame la Présidente, je poursuis pour...
Thank you. I'll continue with Professor Betty. Could you please give us examples on how Quebec has contributed towards research in the Canadian Arctic? Answer. One of the strengths of the Quebec government is probably the implementation of strategic movements between universities and including various disciplines like the Center on Biodiversity, the Inter-University Center for Indigenous Research, Sierra, and others. These strategic groups have Quebec researchers, and this promotes data sharing, infrastructure, encourages broad collaboration in the Arctic, and these groups promote the recruitment of new university researchers that are geared towards northern research. So clearly, this is contributing to Canada's research potential in the north. Recently, there was the Quebec Nordic Institute that was set up to mobilize different research centers to work in the northing, and this receives funds from Quebec and from the Plan North Society in Quebec. This society also supports research, particularly in Nunavik, and this covers the Canadian Arctic. So there are various initiatives that contribute to the training of highly qualified staff in the North and increases our research capacities in the North. Thank you, Professor Betty. I'm very proud to hear that. How can we improve collaboration and knowledge sharing between research communities and people in the North? And so, as I said before, I think we really need assistance. The communities need assistance for research and funding of experts, and the experts as well need help to better support the communities. So it takes professional research, professional resources that are highly specialized and qualified in that domain to maximize partnership. I don't think we have enough professionals that are involved in those communities. Thank you.
Appreciate that. So we now will turn to MP Cannings for 2.5 minutes.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to go back to Dr. Betty, just because you were making some points about long-term data sets earlier, and I just wanted to give you an opportunity to expand on that. We've heard from others in this study about the importance of those and how critical it is to keep the funding going on those long-term data sets, because once they're broken, we've lost a priceless set of information. I'll just let you comment on the value of those data sets, that research, and how we could be doing a better job of funding and promoting that.
Merci.
Thank you very much for your question. As I said, long-term data sets enable us better understand the causes of the changes. Of course, changes could be caused by climate change, but sometimes by other factors, including factors that are happening outside the Arctic. So the long-term data sets are helping us establishing differences between normal, abnormal factors and identify causes. So our funding systems are mainly based on short-term projects, novelty, or programs that target specifically some species, and that's a real problem that prevents us from really understanding the impact of climate change in the Arctic. Something else, the different components of the ecosystems do not respond the same way, with the same pace. some are slower, and that's why our long-term time series analysis, which enable us understand the heterogeneity in the response, because Arctic ecosystems are different. So there's a need to reassemble components that do not respond at the same pace. So long-term data will enable us detect such changes and better prepare for them.
How much time do we have? Okay, Dr. Myers-Smith, do you want to quickly comment on long-term data sets as well? Because you deal with that all the time.
I would absolutely echo everything Joëlle Betty just said. I would just like to highlight one thing. So on Kikiktarkarshal Island, we've been collecting various data sets, and one was the depth of the active layer. And it was something that had sort of been stopped, and our research group brought it back as a long-term data set. And then last summer, suddenly this massive permafrost thaw event happened. And if we hadn't been collecting the long-term data, we wouldn't understand right now what was happening, and we wouldn't be able to make predictions of what's going to happen next summer and into the future. So you can't always anticipate the changes that are coming. You have different rates of change for different parameters of these systems. The impacts are global and also local and are vitally important. We need the data to understand the change that's going on.
Very much.
Thank you.
Okay. So now we are going to turn to the Conservatives for 5 minutes. I'm not sure who. What? Oh, okay. Okay. I'm sorry, we are out of time for this panel. So I do want to thank our witnesses, Dr. Kirk Anderson, Dr. Bing Chan, Dr. Isla Myers-Smith, and Dr. Joel Beatty. It was very, very fascinating testimony. So if you have anything additional that you want to add, you may submit that to the clerk. Please also see the clerk for any questions, and we'll suspend briefly so that we can come back and resume in camera.